Hello, and welcome back to the Perspectives in History podcast. I'm your host, Willem Kahn. Thank you very much for listening. This is part 8 of our series on the Marquis de Lafayette, entitled Reigning in Paris. In the last episode of our series on the Marquis de Lafayette, we covered events from about January 1785 right up to July 1789. This was a period of crisis for the Ancien regime, as the political and social system of France prior to the Revolution is called by historians. Our protagonist, the Marquis de Lafayette, recently returned from a trip to the United States, was determined to do all in his power to introduce some measure of democracy to his native country. The current system of government in France was, in his estimation, not only autocratic and unjust, but in many ways it was also irrational and inefficient. The decrepit reality of the Ancien regime was laid bare by its increasingly precarious financial situation. The Crown had incurred a massive amount of debt in recent years, thanks in no small part to their decision to support the United States during the American War of Independence. By 1786, the state was paying the equivalent of half its annual revenue on interest payments alone. Bankruptcy was inevitable if things continued the way they were going. New taxes had to be levied, but this could not simply happen by royal fiat. The king's subjects, at least the noble ones, had to have some say in the matter to make these actions appear legitimate, and to secure their cooperation. To that end, King Louis XVI, at the behest of his ministers, convened an assembly of notables in May 1787. However, it quickly became apparent that the assembly, a body with no enumerated powers or any semblance of democratic representation, could not adequately address the issue at hand. Lafayette was just one of a number of these notables who called for a true legislative body to be convened. The Crown resisted these demands for as long as it was able, but when the state officially went bankrupt in August 1788, they had no recourse left but to convoke the Estates General. For Lafayette and other liberal-minded members of the noble class, this was a significant step towards implementing the wide-ranging social, political, and economic reforms the kingdom was in desperate need of. Still, it was not a perfect solution. The Estates General was an archaic and undemocratic institution. It was structured in such a way that the first two estates, the clergy and nobility, whose interests were more often than not aligned both with each other and with the crown, were able to consistently outvote the third estate, which was afforded only a singular vote despite representing the overwhelming majority of the kingdom's population. Calls to restructure the Estates General in a more democratic manner went unheeded. Immediately after the Estates General officially opened on May 5, 1789, the delegates of the Third Estate announced their refusal to participate unless they were given voting powers proportional to the amount of people they represented. A few individual delegates of the other two estates voiced their support for the third, but as a whole, the First and Second Estates refused to compromise. The proceedings ground to a halt. Lafayette found himself caught in the middle. His sympathies naturally were with the Third Estate, but in order to secure election to the Estates General in the first place, he had given a pledge to the nobility of his home province that he would not support any alterations to the rules governing the Estates General unless the king himself approved of them. He could do nothing but watch as clergymen and nobles defected to the Third Estate in increasingly greater numbers. On June 17th, the Third Estate declared themselves to constitute a new permanent representative body called the National Assembly. Further defections followed, and within a week, a slim majority of the First Estate's delegates voted to collectively join the National Assembly. On the day that this merger was to take place, however, the deputies of the National Assembly found themselves locked out of their meeting chambers. Reconvening at a nearby tennis court, they vowed not to disperse until they had written a constitution for the kingdom. Louis XVI acquiesced, and subsequently ordered all members of the First and Second Estates to join the National Assembly. With this, Lafayette was released from his obligation to the nobility of Auvergne, and now he was free to participate in the National Assembly. Again, creating a constitution was atop the Assembly's list of priorities. Lafayette was determined to have a hand in this process, and he immediately began putting the finishing touches on a document that he intended to serve as the preamble to this new constitution. This document was, of course, the first draft of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, and he presented it before the National Assembly on July 11, 1789. Initially consisting of 13 points, the Declaration is a foundational document of the French Revolution, and perhaps the earliest universal declaration of human rights. Lafayette did not harbor any illusions that the Declaration would be instantaneously and unanimously accepted. He knew from his familiarity with the situation in the United States that the creation of a constitution was a long, arduous, and occasionally contentious process. In the course of the next several weeks, the declaration would be passed around various committees and subcommittees for revisions. In the immediate term, however, Lafayette would enjoy the spotlight for less than 24 hours, because the very next day, the momentous news broke that Jacques Necker, the Minister of Finance, had been sacked, triggering an immediate and violent response from the people of Paris. To be clear, tensions had been rising in the city for the past several months. The inhabitants of Paris were still suffering from the ongoing food shortages, inflation, and unemployment crises that had affected the nation for the past year and a half. In April, workers at the Réveillon wallpaper factory in the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, a predominantly working-class district in the eastern half of the city, went on strike, prompted by rumors that their boss, Jean-Baptiste Réveillon, had threatened to cut wages. This was not actually true. Réveillon's words had been taken out of context. Beginning on April 26th, between 5,000 and 6,000 workers took to the streets in protest. On the third day, the demonstrations turned violent. Loudly declaring their intention to hang Réveillon, a mob descended on the factory, looting and ransacking it, but just missing their chance to get their hands on the boss. Troops were called in to restore order, and the ensuing violence left between 30 and 300 civilians dead. The rioting was suppressed, but the streets of Paris remained abuzz with revolutionary fervor in the coming months. From the numerous cafes and salons that dotted the city, the people of Paris intently followed every update that came out of Versailles. The epicenter of the mounting unrest was the Palais Royal. This was the property of the king's cousin, Louis-Philippe, the Duc d'Orléans, who, as you'll recall, was an outspoken liberal who allowed his enormous palace to be used by the public for many activities that his cousin Louis would certainly have disapproved of. Arthur Young, an English agriculturalist who was visiting Paris at the time, was scandalized by what he observed there, writing, quote, "The coffee houses in the Palais Royal present yet more singular and astonishing spectacles. They are not only crowded within, but other expectant crowds are at the doors and windows, listening to certain orators who from chairs or tables harangue each his little audience. The eagerness with which they are heard, and the thunder of the applause they receive for every sentiment of more than common hardiness or violence against the present government cannot be easily imagined. I am in amazement at the ministry permitting such nests and hotbeds of sedition, which disseminate among the people every hour, principles that by and by must be opposed with vigor, and therefore it seems little short of madness to allow the propagation at present." End quote. In his journal, Lafayette's new acquaintance, an American statesman named Governor Maurice, wrote in an entry dated July 2nd that the soldiers who had been sent to Paris to keep the peace were largely sympathetic with the common people. Quote, "The soldiery in this city have declared that they will not act against the people. They parade drunkenly about the city, cheering on the Third Estate. A party of dragoons, ordered to disperse a riot, instead thought it better to drink with the rioters." End quote. Morris concluded that the authorities were about to lose control over the city entirely, writing, quote, "The sword has slipped out of the monarch's hands without him perceiving a tittle of the matter." End quote. To outside observers like Morris, it did appear that King Louis XVI had essentially given up the fight by allowing the self-declared National Assembly to continue meeting against his will. In truth, the king, urged on by his wife, Queen Marie Antoinette, and his younger brothers, the Comte de Provence and the Comte d'Artois, had resolved to reassert his authority. In late June and early July, the king ordered a sizable number of troops, 25,000 by most accounts, to muster outside Paris, and Versailles by extension. The king claimed that these soldiers had been called up to contain potential violent disorders in Paris, like the Réveillon riots 3 months prior. The delegates of the National Assembly did not believe him for a second. They were convinced that this was a transparent attempt to intimidate them into submission. The Comte de Mirabeau, the disgraced noble-turned-liberal agitator, who had become the unofficial leader of the National Assembly, pleaded with the king to withdraw the troops, warning that further violence, perhaps even civil war, would be the result if he maintained this course of action. Quote, "The presence of troops in Paris will produce excitement and riot. The first act of violence on the pretext of maintaining public order may begin a horrible sequence of evils." End quote. In Paris, rumors had already been swirling that the forces of counter-revolution were plotting to strike back. The armed force amassing just outside the city only seemed to confirm these suspicions. The fact that more than half of these soldiers were German or Swiss had not gone unnoticed either. France had long employed foreign soldiers in its armies, primarily from Germany and Switzerland. Lafayette's old friend, the Baron de Kalb, was one such individual. To the citizens of Paris, the preponderance of German-speaking troops outside the city did not appear coincidental. If they were ordered to burn Paris, as one of the king's ministers was alleged to have said, they could be relied on to carry out these orders more than the native, read French, troops. In short, the atmosphere within the city was already highly tense when the news of Necker's dismissal broke on July 12th. To the common people, Necker had assumed an almost legendary status. He had become a living, breathing symbol of the Third Estate's triumph over the parasitic aristocrats. Whether this reputation was actually deserved can be debated, but really his performance as the Minister of Finance was beside the point. It was not for that reason that he'd been dismissed, and it was not for that reason that his dismissal provoked such a furious response. That afternoon, thousands of enraged Parisians congregated in and around the Palais Royal, where various orators denounced the, quote, foul plot that this dying aristocracy has hatched against mankind, end quote. The most notable performance of the day was delivered by a 29-year-old lawyer named Camille Desmoulins. Standing atop a table and waving a pistol in the air, Desmoulins warned that Necker's dismissal was the prelude to an absolutist crackdown. Invoking the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572, during which thousands of French Protestants were murdered at the instigation of the Queen, he declared, quote, this very night, all the Swiss and German battalions will leave the Champ de Mars to cut all of our throats. One recourse is left to us, to take up arms, end quote. Before long, similar calls to arms could be heard ringing out across the city, as thousands took to the streets in search of weapons that they would need to defend themselves in the imminent showdown. Mobs began plundering the city for weapons and supplies. The next morning, a raid on the Hôtel des Invalides, a government-sponsored retirement home for disabled veterans, yielded 30,000 muskets, but the gunpowder had been quietly removed to the Bastille prison in the event of a general uprising. Originally constructed during the 100 Years' War, the Bastille was a large medieval fortress located in the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, the same district where the Réveillon riots had taken place. For centuries, this imposing structure had loomed menacingly over the city, a symbol of absolutist tyranny. It is true that the Bastille had served as a state prison since at least the reign of Louis XIV, but in many ways the reality of the Bastille was not nearly as sordid as the popular imagination held. To begin with, the only people ever imprisoned in the Bastille were nobles. Oftentimes these were government ministers accused of plotting treason, writers who had penned seditious tracts, courtiers who had personally run afoul of someone who outranked them, and even young nobles whose own families petitioned for them to be incarcerated for their delinquency. Since the prisoners usually belonged to the upper class, their accommodations were actually rather humane compared to other prisons at the time. The cells were relatively spacious and surprisingly well furnished. The prisoners were allowed to have alcohol and tobacco and to play billiards and card games with each other and occasionally the guards. More than one inmate praised the quality of the food that they were given. More to the point, by the reign of Louis XVI, the Bastille had largely fallen into disuse as a prison. On average, no more than 20 inmates were held there annually. And as of July 14, 1789, there were only 7. 4 had been convicted of forgery. 2 had been designated as, to use the parlance of the time, lunatics. And 1 was a young aristocrat being detained at his family's request. Ironically, the 2 quote-unquote lunatics were promptly reincarcerated by the revolutionaries shortly after their liberation. All that having been said, though, much like Jacques Necker, it was not the reality of the Bastille that mattered to the people so much as what it had come to represent. Historian Simon Schama makes this point rather succinctly in his book Citizens, a Chronicle of the French Revolution. Quote, as the reality of the Bastille became more of an anachronism, its demonology became more important in defining opposition to state power. If the monarchy was to be depicted, not unjustly, as arbitrary, obsessed with secrecy, and vested with capricious powers of life and death over its subjects, then the Bastille was the perfect embodiment of those vices. If it had not existed, it is safe to say that it would have to have been invented. End quote. So with all this in mind, emotions ran high as some 1,000 citizens surrounded the prison and demanded the soldiers inside surrender their gunpowder. The sequence of events that followed is somewhat muddled. Allegedly, the commander of the garrison tried to negotiate with the rioters, but at some point, and for some reason, the negotiations broke down in the heat of the moment. The guards opened fire on the demonstrators, killing about 100 and wounding as many. In retaliation, the protesters fell upon the prison en masse, overwhelming its defenders and seizing it for the people. 1 defender was killed during the assault, and between 3 to 5 others were lynched by the mob in the aftermath. The garrison's commander, a man named Bernard René de Launay, whom many held responsible for starting the day's bloodbath, was seized and dragged from the fortress. The people intended to put him on trial, but when he lashed out and kicked one of his captors in the groin, they summarily stabbed him to death. The pastry chef, who Launay had kicked, decapitated him, and his severed head was put on the end of a pike and paraded through the streets. The French Revolution had begun in earnest. While these events were unfolding in Paris, the National Assembly, still based in Versailles, was slow to receive the news and even slower to react. As of the afternoon of July 13th, the delegates of the National Assembly were dimly aware that Paris was in disorder, but they did not yet know how grave the situation was about to become. The Assembly sent a deputation to the king to plead with him to withdraw the troops. Louis dismissed their concerns out of hand, telling them, quote, "I have already made known my intentions regarding the measures the disorders of Paris have forced me to take. It is for me alone to judge their necessity." End quote. As the day wound to a close, the deputies of the National Assembly worried that if they were to adjourn for the evening, they would likely be locked out of their chambers the next day. They voted unanimously to remain in emergency session through the night. The current president of the Assembly, an elderly archbishop, indicated he was unable to continue presiding over such a session, so a vote was taken to elect a vice president. Our protagonist, the Marquis de Lafayette, won this vote by a comfortable margin. In a brief acceptance speech, Lafayette declared his intention to stand his ground, while at the same time indicating that he was prepared for the worst. Quote, "My chief duty is to never separate myself from your efforts to maintain peace and confirm public liberty. The Constitution shall be, even if we no longer shall be." End quote. The next day, July 14th, dawned without any significant updates from the city. The atmosphere in the meeting chamber remained tense. In a message he sent to a friend that day, Lafayette expressed his hope that the worst of the disturbances in Paris had passed, and that the situation would soon return to normal. Quote, "The vice presidency has earned me a sleepless night. I asked whether it was appropriate to end the session. The majority shouted that we should not separate, and that it was necessary to stay. Many members of the municipalities and several members of the nobility and clergy paced the room while I dozed briefly on a bench. We are told that everything in Paris is quiet. I imagine that we will receive an update next morning. I hope we will be able to get to bed soon." End quote. It was around 2 o'clock in the morning of July 15th when the Assembly was informed of the previous day's horrific events. Apparently, one of the messengers was none other than Lafayette's own kinsman, the Vicomte de Noailles. Lafayette called the panic-stricken delegates to order, and they began discussing how to address the situation. After some time, their deliberation was interrupted by the royal chamberlain, who announced that His Majesty would be making an appearance at the next morning's session. Right up until the fall of the Bastille, Louis had continually underestimated the gravity of the situation. As one possibly apocryphal anecdote tells it, when he was first informed of the events of July 14th, the king asked if a full-on revolt had broken out, to which the messenger is said to have replied, quote, "No, sire, it is a revolution." End quote. Amid the wave of anarchic violence that inundated the city after July 12th, a large number of Third Estate electors representing Paris, between 120 and 150 depending on the account, convened at the Hôtel de Ville, French for City Hall, and declared themselves to constitute an emergency government for the city, a government that is referred to by historians as the Paris Commune. This should not be confused with the similarly named Paris Commune of 1871. I should note that at that time, the word commune did not have any particularly left-wing connotations, and simply referred to an administrative division at the city level. For our purposes here, it may be helpful to think of commune as being interchangeable with municipality. Anyway, the most immediate priorities of this ad hoc government were to defend Paris against external attack and to re-establish order internally. For those purposes, the commune declared the formation of a citizen militia on July 13th. Initially called the Bourgeois Guard, it would soon after be rechristened as the National Guard. Of course, declaring the existence of a citizen militia did not mean that one would suddenly materialize from thin air. In a matter of days, some 12,000 men had enlisted, but as yet they were leaderless and unorganized. When the question of who should command this militia was inevitably raised, the Commune's electors unanimously agreed that there was one man suited for the job, the Marquis de Lafayette. To them he appeared to be the only figure who held the respect and confidence of the public. Any other choice, they concluded, would likely have engendered strong opposition. His friend, the abolitionist writer the Marquis de Condorcet, made a rather eloquent case for him, stating, quote, "He is like a character from a novel, who, by the brilliance of his adventures, his youth, his figure, and his fame, can enchant, so to speak, the imaginations, and rally all popular interests to it." End quote. At 11 a.m. on the morning of July 15th, 1789, King Louis XVI entered the Hôtel des Menus de Plaisir du Roi, the meeting hall of the National Assembly. He did so rather solemnly, without the usual pomp and circumstance, or the absurdly large retinue of courtiers that typically accompanied him wherever he went. He addressed those present as members of the National Assembly, a phrase that he had heretofore taken great pains to avoid uttering. Even more remarkably, the king asked for their cooperation in putting an end to the crisis. To this end, he promised to withdraw his soldiers from Paris. He also promised to reform the criminal code, to end the corvée system of government-mandated forced labor, and to abolish judicial torture, among other things. All of these measures were intended as concessions to the people of Paris. As for the National Assembly itself, he recognized their claim to represent the people of France, their right to assemble, and their power to legislate, albeit with his consent. Once the king concluded his speech, the entire hall erupted with rapturous applause and cheers of "Long live the king." The king then started to make his way back to the palace, escorted by the various deputies of the National Assembly. In the street, between the palace and the meeting hall, was a large crowd of commoners who had made their way from Paris. Caught up in the celebratory atmosphere of the moment, many of them tried to approach the king directly, for the chance to kiss his hand. Only the deputies were there to keep them back. It was decided to send a deputation of 88 assemblymen to deliver the joyous news to the citizens of Paris. Lafayette, as the vice president of the assembly, rode at the head of the procession of carriages that made its way from Versailles that afternoon. The electors of the Commune met them at the edge of the city and escorted them the rest of the way to the Hôtel de Ville. Once there, Jean-Sylvain Bailly, the astronomer-turned-politician, who had initially won fame by presiding over the tennis court oath, read aloud the king's concession speech that he'd made mere hours earlier. Further cheers of "Long live the king" and "Long live the nation" ensued. As the acclamation began to die down, one of the electors spoke up, proposing that Lafayette be named commander of the National Guard, saying that it was only fitting that, quote, "the defense of French liberty should be entrusted to the illustrious defender of the liberty of the New World," end quote. This motion was met with instantaneous and unanimous agreement. Even though by his own account, Lafayette had no knowledge that he was even being considered for such a position, he accepted it without hesitation. The following passage comes directly from the official record of that day's proceedings. Quote, "All voices joined together to proclaim the Marquis de Lafayette as Commander-General of the Paris militia. The Marquis, accepting this honor with every sign of respect and gratitude, drew his sword and swore to sacrifice his life for the preservation of the precious liberty that he was now entrusted with defending." End quote. Moments later, the Commune acclaimed Bailly as the Mayor of Paris, making him the first person to hold that title in the city's history. Historically, the head of the municipal government of Paris had held the title of Chief Magistrate. Lafayette's appointment as the commander of the Paris militia was a highly significant event in his career. It was thanks to this appointment that he would, for a brief window of time, become the most powerful individual in Paris, arguably of France at large. Paris was rapidly supplanting Versailles as the center of national power, a reality that Lafayette recognized. At a meeting of the Paris Commune that following day, July 16th, Lafayette asserted that it was necessary, with riots being reported across the country, that other municipalities follow the example of Paris and form their own companies of civilian militia. Hence, it was at his suggestion that the Bourgeois Guard was rechristened as the National Guard. Lafayette, as commander of the National Guard of Paris, would naturally assume a preeminent position over the regiments being formed in other municipalities, thereby allowing him to extend his influence far beyond the Paris city limits, at least in theory. In reality, Lafayette would spend the better part of the next 3 years struggling just to keep a handle on things in Paris, let alone outside of it. The situation within the city would remain so volatile in the coming months that, as Lafayette himself put it, quote, "the well-being of Paris demands that I not remove myself for even a moment," end quote. It was for that reason that Lafayette was, for the most part, unable to participate further in the proceedings of the National Assembly, despite never formally resigning from the body. Lafayette's chief duties as commander of the National Guard of Paris were, as he understood them, twofold: the preservation of liberty and the re-establishment of public order. It doesn't take a thinker as incisive as Voltaire or Rousseau to understand the inherent contradiction here, and it wouldn't be long before Lafayette came to understand it too. That morning, after donning once more the uniform of a French army officer, he mounted his horse and made his way from his home to the Hôtel de Ville. As he left, he bade farewell to his wife and his 3 children. Adrienne held him in a prolonged embrace and gazed on solemnly as he departed. Their daughter Virginie later recalled how, quote, "not once in those days did she see him leave the house without the feeling that she might be saying her goodbyes to him for the last time," end quote. As Lafayette approached the Hôtel de Ville, he found his path blocked by a huge, excited crowd. He questioned a bystander as to what exactly was going on, and he casually told him that they were about to lynch a priest. Appalled, Lafayette rode his horse directly into the crowd, grabbed their would-be victim, and escorted him to safety. As Lafayette and the electors of the Commune met within the Hôtel de Ville, similar scenes continued to play out throughout the day. That afternoon, a troop of National Guardsmen dragged a terrified man to the public square in front of the building, demanded that he be executed at once. This particular group hailed from the Cordelier district and was led by a man named Georges Danton, a radical lawyer and street agitator who had appointed himself as a National Guard captain. He claimed that this person that he and his men had detained was the assistant governor of the Bastille, who was at least partially responsible for the massacre. Lafayette, hearing the disturbance, exited the building and confronted Danton, demanding to know the full story. Danton, as it turned out, was not telling the full truth. This man that they were poised to execute was actually a city councilman, who the Commune had temporarily placed in charge of the Bastille after July 14th, while they deliberated on what was to be done with the building. Lafayette ordered them to release the man and proceeded to chastise Danton before sending him on his way. Why exactly Danton was so intent on killing this councilman is unclear, but from that moment onward, he would hold a grudge against Lafayette until the day he died. These two would be at each other's throats many times in the future. In a letter that he wrote to his friend, the Madame de Simian, that evening, Lafayette described the precarity of his position. Quote, "I've already saved the lives of 6 people about to be hanged in different quarters of the city. The people are insane, drunk with power. They will not listen to me forever. As I write now, 80,000 people have surrounded the Hôtel de Ville and cry out that we are lying to them, that the troops are not withdrawing, and that the king must come here. The very moment I am gone, they lose their minds. My situation is unlike anyone else's. I reign in Paris, but I reign over an angry population aroused by evil conspirators." End quote. Only one day into the job, Lafayette was already beginning to appreciate the nearly impossible nature of the task delegated to him. One of the reasons why Lafayette had been unanimously chosen to lead the National Guard in the first place was because of his past experience leading a revolutionary citizen militia in America. But there were stark differences between the situations Lafayette faced in America and the situation he faced here in Paris. To begin with, almost as many people lived in Paris as lived in the entire state of Virginia, the most populous of the 13 states. Never before had Lafayette had to manage such a large and restive urban population as that of Paris. Chama provides a concise analysis of the challenges that Lafayette faced in these earliest days of the Revolution. Quote, "In Paris, the crucial dilemma of how to remain the master rather than the helpless servant of revolutionary force turned to the Marquis de Lafayette. He was so commanding a figure in the summer and early autumn of 1789 that one almost forgets that he was just 32 years old and a complete political novice. Nothing in his American experience could have prepared him for what he faced in Paris and its surroundings, for he imagined the advent of liberty as an uncomplicated crusade with readily identifiable heroes and villains. He assumed that, when the critical moment came, a shared concern for the common good would bury all differences in an outburst of fraternal accord. But nothing like this happy scenario was unfolding in the streets of Paris. Rather, he was confronted daily by desperately hungry, irrationally suspicious crowds that could turn in a matter of hours from angry to murderous. Lafayette was forced to develop very rapidly skills as a labor negotiator, conflict arbitrator, militia commander, and political diplomat. The wonder is not that his powers would eventually fail him, but that he managed to hold on for as long as he did." Unquote. If the vast and temperamental mobs of Paris were something that he could not control, the same could be said of the citizen militiamen of the National Guard that he ostensibly commanded. As of yet, the National Guard was really more of an idea than an actual organization. Of them, Lafayette was reported to have commented, quote, "I may seem to be their chief, but I am far from being their master." Unquote. He had tried to establish some semblance of an administrative structure when he rechristened the militia as the National Guard in the first place, but the real work of molding the National Guard into a loyal and effective force would come further down the line. In the immediate term, Lafayette did what was in his power to restore order to the city, having the streets cleared of criminals, vagrants, and other undesirable elements, and trying to resume the normal flow of commerce. More than anything else, the restoration of public order in Paris hinged on the immediate material conditions. Rumors continued to abound of a royalist conspiracy to starve Paris into submission. To quell these rumors, and ensure that there was an adequate enough supply of food in the city so as not to provoke further unrest, Lafayette saw to it that shipments of grain were brought in regularly, escorted by troops of National Guards. Another important project that Lafayette oversaw at this time was the demolition of the Bastille. This was not a decision he made himself, as some sources claim. The question of what should be done with the building was a topic of much debate among the revolutionaries, a debate that was settled when Mirabeau took a pickaxe to the edifice himself, knocking loose the first few stones to massive applause from below. Chama characterizes what happened next as a free-for-all, as people from the surrounding area rushed in to participate in the demolition themselves. Many claimed bits of the structure as souvenirs. Lafayette even got in on the action, salvaging the large wrought iron key to the fortress's main gate and sending it to Washington as a gift. Visitors to Mount Vernon can still see this key today. After a couple days, Lafayette had the National Guard move in to impose some order on the project. With several hundred workers on the job, the fortress was completely demolished in the course of just 4 months. Still, there was only so much that Lafayette could do to pacify the city. As he stated in his letter of July 16th, there was still an overwhelming sense among the people that they were being deceived. The withdrawal of the king's troops from the city was not taking place nearly quickly enough. They demanded that the king make a public appearance to reaffirm his supposed promises. Before long, Lafayette too had come to the conclusion that there was no other way to resolve the situation. The king must come to Paris and face his people. At the time that this demand reached the king on the night of July 16th, Versailles was already gripped by panic. The ultra-royalist faction of the court, among whom Queen Marie Antoinette and his younger brother the Comte d'Artois were most prominent, urged Louis to relocate away from Paris, rally loyal troops, and crush the revolution by force. As usual, the king hesitated to take such a decisive action. Artois, unwilling to tolerate this humiliation any longer, resolved to flee the country with his immediate family, and he was not the only one. Dozens of others chose to follow suit, including the princes of Conti and Condé, the heads of 2 cadet branches of the ruling house of Bourbon, the Duc de Polignac and his wife Yolande de Polastron, one of the queen's closest confidants, the minister of war the Duc de Broglie, not to be confused with Lafayette's old mentor the Comte de Broglie, who died in 1781, the most recent prime minister the Baron de Breteuil, and the disgraced former finance minister Charles-Alexandre de Calonne. These were just a few of the hundreds of nobles who fled France in the immediate aftermath of the storming of the Bastille, and they would be joined by thousands more in the coming months. Even the queen herself was preparing to go into exile. She had her most valuable jewelry packed into cases and loaded onto her carriage, and she had a cache of her personal documents incinerated, lest they be discovered in her absence. But Louis would not flee. He felt he had no choice but to accede to the demands that he go and show himself in Paris. Marie Antoinette pleaded with him not to, but he insisted, claiming that he felt confident that his own subjects would do him no harm. And so, on the morning of July 17th, Louis XVI boarded a carriage and set off for Paris. Anxious to avoid further antagonizing the Parisians, the king ordered his corps of bodyguards, the Black Musketeers as they were known, to stay behind. Instead, the king was accompanied by about 400 deputies of the National Assembly. This procession was greeted at the city gates by a delegation of municipal officials headed by Bailly and Lafayette. Bailly, in a gesture of good faith, presented Louis with the ceremonial keys to the city. These, he told the king, were the very same keys that had been presented to his predecessor, King Henri IV, over 200 years ago. For context, Henri IV was the first monarch of the House of Bourbon to rule France. Raised by his mother as a Protestant, Henri inherited the throne in 1589, during a period in which France was riven by a long-running series of civil wars between Catholics and Protestants. 4 years later, he prepared to enter the capital, but aware that the inhabitants of the city would never accept a Protestant monarch, he renounced his faith and converted to Catholicism, allegedly uttering, quote, "Paris is well worth a mass," end quote. Subsequent generations praised Henri IV for his wisdom and willingness to compromise for the good of his subjects. This was a story that his descendant, Louis XVI, would no doubt have been familiar with. Upon handing him the keys to the city, Bailly declared, quote, "He had regained his people, but here it is the people who have regained their king. This is the most beautiful day of the monarchy, the occasion of an eternal alliance between the monarch and his people," end quote. Once that bit of ceremony had been concluded, a massive procession began leading the king to the Hôtel de Ville. As the king made his way through the crowded streets within his carriage, he was flanked on either side by a company of National Guard, with Lafayette leading the way from atop his stark white horse. Some observers remarked disapprovingly that the National Guard, many of whom were armed with pikes and agricultural implements, looked more like a street gang than a militia. Governor Maurice was astounded by the restraint demonstrated by this ragtag militia and their leader. Quote, "He, Lafayette, held his sovereign, during the procession to Paris, completely within his power. He marched him where he pleased, measured out the degree of applause that he should receive as he pleased, and if he pleased, he could have detained him as a prisoner." End quote. Recent events may very well have led one to believe that there was mutual antipathy between the king and the Marquis, but despite the fact that the two men now found themselves on opposing sides of this political conflict, Lafayette harbored absolutely no ill will towards his sovereign. In fact, even though his actions had caused him to fall out of the king's good graces, Lafayette maintained that everything he'd done was intended to help the king, to help him adapt to the changes brought on by the revolution, to continue his rule, albeit under the constraints of a liberal constitution, and above all to embrace his new role as the king of the people. Lafayette was greatly moved by the fact that, despite their political differences, Louis had entrusted him with his personal safety, later writing of this, quote, "The day he surrendered to me, I became more devoted to his service than if he had promised me half his kingdom." End quote. Still, it would be a mistake to characterize Lafayette's attitude toward the king as one of unflinching obedience. His allegiance was conditional, writing in the same passage, quote, "If the king refuses the Constitution, I will fight him. If he accepts it, I will defend him." End quote. After an hour, the procession arrived at their destination. An honor guard made up of Parisian electors flanked the walkway to the main entrance of the Hôtel de Ville with their swords drawn. As Louis approached, they raised their swords over their heads and formed a ceremonial arch under which the king passed. Making his way inside, Louis was escorted to a hastily set-up throne in the meeting hall. Above it was a banner that read, quote, "Louis XVI, Father of the French, and the King of a Free People." End quote. Bailly then approached the king, holding in his hand a cockade, a combination of red, white, and blue ribbons that was already becoming a popular symbol of the revolution. These, of course, remain the national colors of France to this day. There are many popular misconceptions about the meaning of these colors. One holds that each of these three colors represented a part of the revolution's unofficial motto, liberty, equality, and fraternity. The actual origins are a bit more mundane. As civilian militias began to form in Paris in the immediate run-up to the storming of the Bastille, they wore ribbons of red and blue, the traditional colors of Paris, to distinguish themselves. White, a color traditionally associated with the French monarchy, and the Bourbon dynasty in particular, was added afterwards, supposedly at the insistence of Lafayette, who intended for it to symbolize the unity of the king and the nation. The king accepted the cockade that Bailly offered to him and wordlessly affixed it to his hat, as celebratory cannon shots and jubilant cries rang out. Those in attendance expected the king to deliver an address on this occasion, but Louis, visibly perturbed by the day's events and never much of a public speaker to begin with, struggled to summon the words. He managed to quietly stammer through a brief statement about how he loved his people deeply and wished for calm, leaving it to Bailly to relay for everyone else to hear. He also took the opportunity to reaffirm Bailly and Lafayette in their respective offices. And now, a word from our sponsor. And now, back to the show. In the previous episode, I suggested that Lafayette and his fellow liberal noblemen in the Society of 30 were short-sighted for believing that it was possible to enact meaningful change to France's political structure while managing to avoid a prolonged and violent revolutionary struggle. But, as Lafayette biographer W.E. Woodward writes, anyone who witnessed the events of July 17, 1789, quote, would have assumed that the worst was over, that the king and his people had reconciled, end quote. For just a brief moment, it seemed that with the king's sanctioning of the revolution, the people's will had triumphed. All that remained to be done was for the National Assembly to finish writing a constitution and submit it to the king for his signature, something that the king, as the benevolent father of the French people, would surely do. For Lafayette, any hopes that may have been inspired by the king's visit would be swiftly and brutally dashed, because, on July 22nd, he bore witness to a particularly grisly episode of the people's justice. The victims were two widely hated royal officials, Joseph-François Foulon de Douai and Louis Berthier de Sauvigny. Foulon was a 74-year-old financier and arch-conservative, who had been appointed by the king to replace the people's beloved Jacques Necker as Minister of Finance. Of course, he lost his new position within a matter of days, when the king was compelled to recall Necker to service. Despite the brevity of his tenure, Foulon had somehow managed to make himself an object of the people's hatred. As the story goes, Foulon, at a meeting discussing the potential of a famine in Paris, commented that, quote, "The people will be happy if we give them hay to eat," end quote. Whether or not this is something that Foulon actually said was immaterial. The public at large believed that he had, and for them that was more than enough. Berthier was the intendant of Paris, which meant that he was effectively the supervisor of all royal officials in the city. His great crime had been profiteering at the expense of the people by speculating in grain during the harsh winter of the past year. As the son-in-law of Foulon, Berthier was also guilty by association. After the fall of the Bastille, both Foulon and Berthier made arrangements to skip town, possibly to leave the country entirely. Foulon had even gone so far as to fake his own death, complete with a staged funeral and everything. He did not manage to make it far. He was hiding out in a rental property he owned on the outskirts of the city when one of his own tenants betrayed him to the National Guard. On the morning of July 22nd, Foulon was dragged in front of the Hôtel de Ville by an angry mob. Neither Lafayette nor Bailly were at the scene at that moment, forcing the councilmen who were present to make a decision. They ruled that since Foulon had not yet been convicted of any crime, he should be placed in temporary custody at the Abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés until he was able to stand trial. However, with the mob outside already issuing demands for the man's head, the electors determined that it was too dangerous to have him transferred at that moment. Instead, they would hold him there and wait until they could escort him to the prison under the cover of darkness. As the day went on, word of Foulon's location spread through the city, and more people converged on the Hôtel de Ville, baying for his immediate execution. By the time Lafayette arrived at the Hôtel de Ville, the mob had already seized the building. Lafayette hurried up to the main meeting chamber where he found Foulon standing before an ad hoc revolutionary tribunal, whose verdict was predetermined. Aghast at the scene, Lafayette cried out to the people, quote, "You want to kill this man without a judgment. It is an injustice that would dishonor you, that would dishonor me, that would dishonor all the efforts I have made on behalf of liberty. I demand only respect for the law, without which there is no liberty, without which I would not have supported the revolution in the New World, and without which I will not support the revolution in progress here." End quote. Lafayette clarified that he would not continue to defend Foulon if he was truly guilty, but that a proper trial must be held to judge whether that was the case. Lafayette was still respected enough to command the mob's attention, but only for a brief moment. A local newspaper would praise Lafayette's speech for, quote, "the justice of his ideas, the grace of his expressions, and the truth of his movements," end quote. In the heat of the moment, Lafayette's impassioned plea, regardless of how eloquent and morally upright it may have been, produced little effect. Hardly had he concluded his oration when a group of people surged toward the front of the room. They seized Foulon and dragged him from the room to the public square in front of the building. Initially, the mob tried to hang the unfortunate man from a lamp post, but the rope was too weak. It snapped and Foulon fell to the ground. Rather than attempting to hang him again, the crowd simply set upon the man and literally tore him to pieces. At one point, Foulon's head was separated from his body. His severed head was then stuck atop a pike, and his mouth was stuffed with hay, as one final and grimly ironic act of humiliation. As all this was unfolding, a cart passed by the scene escorted by a troop of cavalry. This cart just so happened to be carrying Foulon's son-in-law, Berthier, who had been apprehended a day earlier and was being taken to a nearby prison. Seeing Berthier, the mob charged the cart. One man bearing the pike with Foulon's severed head waved it in front of the horrified Berthier. In a matter of minutes, the crowd toppled the cart, seized Berthier, and subjected him to a similarly grisly fate. Afterwards, one man excitedly rushed into the Hôtel de Ville, holding what the sources describe only as a lump of meat, exclaiming that it was Berthier's heart, offering it as a votive gift to Lafayette, who could do little else but look on in terror. This was all too much for him. The fact that he had been powerless to stop this gruesome spectacle from unfolding right in front of him was the cause for intense distress. The next day, Lafayette appeared before the Commune to resign his post as commander of the National Guard of Paris. His resignation letter read in part, quote, "I was called to the military command of the capital by the people on the condition of their complete and universal confidence in me. I have continually told the people that I would defend their interests to my dying breath so long as they heeded my words. The people have not heeded me, and, as I stated from the beginning, the day when I no longer have the confidence they promised to me is the day that I shall abandon this position, because I can no longer be useful." End quote. The electors felt differently. They pleaded with Lafayette, practically begging him to retain his command. Before Lafayette had the opportunity to elaborate any further, the Assembly unanimously reaffirmed his position. Their statement, as read into the official records, was as follows, quote, "We, the electors in all the districts of the city of Paris, reflecting the unanimous acclamation of the citizens of Paris, and our entire confidence in the virtues, talents, and patriotism of the Marquis de Lafayette, once more proclaim him Commander General of the National Guard of Paris, and promise in our own names as those of our brothers in our districts, submission and obedience to all his orders, so that his zeal, seconded by all patriotic citizens, may complete to perfection the great work of public liberty." End quote. Lafayette was conflicted, to say the least, as he wrote in a letter to Simeon, quote, "What am I to do? I am in despair. I cannot abandon the citizens who placed all their confidence in me, but if I remain, I put myself in the terrible situation of witnessing evil without remedying it." End quote. In the hopes of enticing him to remain, the electors offered to greatly enhance his political powers, effectively making him the governor-general of Paris. They also offered him an enormous annual salary of 120,000 livres. Lafayette ultimately did decide to rescind his resignation after 2 days, but in emulation of his idol George Washington, he rejected both offers of power and wealth. Addressing the Commune's electors on July 29th, he insisted on maintaining a clear separation of civil and military power. Quote, "It is to the mayor of the city of Paris, and to your representatives, gentlemen, that all petitions must be made, and it is from them that each decision must emanate, to watch over the safety of the capital, preserve order among its citizens, to execute the decrees of the representatives, to live to obey you, and if necessary, die to defend you. These are the sole functions of him whom you have deigned to name commander-in-chief." End quote. On the matter of his proposed salary, he stated, quote, "When so many citizens suffer and so many expenditures are necessary, it is repugnant to me to augment them unnecessarily. My fortune is sufficient for the state in which I live, and my time does not permit official entertaining." End quote. The reaction to his attempted resignation had convinced Lafayette that he was the only person capable of accomplishing the twofold mission that had been entrusted to him, and in the following days he displayed renewed vigor in his position as commander of the National Guard. His top priority was to impose some organization and discipline on the National Guard. By now, I'm sure you've gotten the sense that the organizational structure of the militia had been rather informal up to this point. As Lafayette's recent encounter with Georges Danton indicated, in the chaotic days of late July 1789, practically anyone could simply pick up a weapon and declare themselves a National Guardsman. This meant that while the National Guard had a preponderance of manpower on paper, the degree to which Lafayette was able to command these men was quite limited. The ranks abounded with criminals and miscreants who used their positions as a cover to flout the law. Lafayette recognized that if public order was ever to be restored in Paris, the National Guard had to be transformed into a dependable, regularized, and semi-professional force. To this end, he introduced a number of new regulations. He created standards for their uniforms, weapons, and equipment. True to the Guard's original name, the bourgeois militia, Lafayette established that most of these men were expected to procure their own supplies and were to serve on a voluntary basis. This had the effect of weeding out undesirable elements from the ranks, ensuring that the National Guard would only consist of men from the more respectable middle class who could pay their own way, and whose loyalty Lafayette could be assured of. There seems to be some confusion among the sources as to the actual size of the National Guard at this time. Lafayette himself claimed to command 6 divisions of about 8,000 men each, which would put the Guard's total strength at just under 50,000. Some historians take him at his word on this, but more modern sources place this number closer to 30 than 50,000. Whatever the case, Lafayette designated about 6,000 salaried guardsmen to serve as the professional corps of the National Guard. These were, for the most part, men with recent military experience. About half were the men of the now-defunct French Guards Regiment, which had acted as the permanent garrison of Paris. After the regiment was disbanded at the King's order after July 14th, its men were absorbed into the National Guard. Officers were drawn from this group, as well as veterans from the American War of Independence who had fought in the French contingent at Yorktown. Lafayette divided these 6,000 professional salaried men into companies of 80 to 100 each, and dispersed them evenly across the various districts of the city to serve alongside the volunteers. If there was one lesson that Lafayette learned from his time in America that would serve him well in his new role, it was the importance of a strong sense of identity in creating an effective fighting force, especially a newly formed one. An important step in this direction was the standardization of the uniforms, as well as his creation of the tricolor cockade, which became a mandatory part of the uniform. Lafayette was keenly aware of the power of symbols, and he intended for the red, white, and blue cockade to take on a greater significance as an emblem of the revolution itself. The following quotation comes from a speech he delivered to the electors of Paris on July 16th. Quote, "I place before you a cockade which will go around the world, and an institution, civil and military, which is bound to triumph over the old ways of Europe, and which will reduce arbitrary governments to the choice of being conquered if they do not imitate it, and overthrown if they choose to irritate it." End quote. The fact that these colors have endured as signifiers of the French nation to this day, despite the fact that their original meanings have long since become obscured by centuries of popular misunderstanding, speaks to their potency as symbols. Although he had never been the most pious individual, Lafayette was not above instrumentalizing religion to strengthen the men's devotion to the revolutionary cause. He had his officers administer an oath to each new recruit, swearing to defend the nation, the king, and the law. Each battalion was instructed to design its own battle standard, which was to be ceremonially blessed in a local church. Lafayette did his best to attend these ceremonies himself, and sent someone in his stead, typically by Lee, when he could not. On September 27th, he had National Guard battalions throughout the city assemble at Notre Dame Cathedral for a general benediction, presided over by a radical priest named Claude Fauché, whose sermon was on the righteousness of the revolutionary cause. On August 4th, Lafayette's close friend and relation, the Vicomte de Noailles, stood before the National Assembly to make an astonishing proposal, the abolition of noble privilege. Noailles' proposal had not come completely out of the ether. It was made in response to a wave of popular unrest in the countryside that historians have since dubbed the Great Fear. Similar to what had occurred in the cities, discontent had been mounting in rural France since the winter of the previous year, on account of the shortage of grain and other foodstuffs. Panic began to take hold in these rural communities, as rumors circulated that the noble class, fearful of the peasants' revolutionary potential, had begun purposely withholding grain in the hopes of starving them out. In response, peasants across the country took up arms, organized themselves into volunteer militias that attacked the properties of the nobility and the clergy, raiding their storehouses for food, while at the same time they seized and burned documentation of their feudal obligations and debts. As the Great Fear gripped all of France, leaving hardly any part of the country untouched, it was reasoned that something had to be done to quell this violence. Noailles, in proposing the abolition of noble privilege, presented this course of action as the best way to restore order in the countryside. Practically all those present were in agreement, but what Noailles was proposing could not simply be accomplished through a single piece of legislation. Noble privilege was not a single law, but an entire corpus of laws that had been built up through centuries of feudal rule. One by one, the representatives stood up to decry some law or other and to propose its abolition. These included exclusive hunting rights, the right to levy taxes, the right to purchase public offices, and the system of government-mandated forced labor known as the corvée. In this one frenzied all-night session, the National Assembly effectively abolished the entire basis of the feudal order. This series of legislation is referred to by historians collectively as the August Decrees. Now, legislating feudalism out of existence was one thing, but effecting that change was another entirely. As the historian Henri Doniol reminds the reader in his 1883 book on the subject, quote, "The feudal forms disappeared, but the effects of feudalism would take much longer to die out, and would continue to exist owing to the difficulties inherent in escaping from them. And thus the interests of the landowners would continue to be maintained without any overt breach of the pledges made on August 4th. End quote. Still, with the legal basis of the Ancien regime having been done away with, the deputies of the National Assembly now turned to fully devote their energies toward the creation of a constitution on which a new order would be predicated. Very quickly it became apparent that this would not be a very harmonious process. A series of debates ensued as to the specific shape that the new order was to take, with the most contentious subjects being over the structure of the Legislative Assembly and the executive powers allocated to the king. Writing to John Jay in mid-September, Thomas Jefferson explained that, in his estimation, there were roughly 4 blocks vying for supremacy within the National Assembly at that time. First was the faction he referred to as the aristocrats, and whom I may refer to as the royalists. This was the most conservative group, comprising what remained of the First and Second Estates delegations, for the most part. They sought to retain as much monarchical, aristocratic, and ecclesiastical authority as possible, and to keep the reforms to a bare minimum. This group was affiliated with the ultra-royalist faction at court around Marie Antoinette that I've referred to in the past, and their participation in the National Assembly and in the creation of a constitution was reluctant at best. Next, there was the bloc that Jefferson considered centrists. These were royalists who supported a constitution similar to that of England. that is to say, a constitutional monarchy with a bicameral legislature, consisting of an elected lower house and a non-elected upper house, serving as a check on the monarch's executive power. Third were the Orleanists, a slightly more liberal offshoot of the center that specifically supported the king's cousin, the Duc d'Orléans. Jefferson dismissed this group out of hand as, quote, wicked and desperate, end quote. Then, finally, there was the Republican faction, as Jefferson called them. He acknowledged that this characterization was not, strictly speaking, accurate, since a sizable proportion of the faction was, in Jefferson's own words, quote, willing to allow their first magistrate to be hereditary, albeit very subordinated to the legislature, end quote. In essence, they did hope to create a constitutional monarchy, but they differed from the aforementioned moderate faction in that they hoped to relegate the monarch to a mostly ceremonial position with very limited executive powers, thereby making France into a republic in all but name. This was the view of Lafayette and his allies in the Assembly, like the Abbé Sieyès, the Marquis de Condorcet, and the Comte de Mirabeau, though his relationship with Mirabeau was tenuous at best. There was also within this Republican bloc a contingent of actual Republicans, that is to say those advocating the total abolition of the monarchy. It was from this group that the Jacobin Club would emerge, and though the Jacobins are the most widely known faction from the French Revolution, it would not be until 1793 that they would actually take power. As of 1789, although they had quite a bit of popular support, they were seen as fringe radicals in the Assembly, and during these debates begrudgingly allied themselves to the more moderate faction led by Lafayette, Mirabeau, and company. By mid-August, Lafayette felt that the situation in Paris was stable enough for him to redirect some of his attention to his duties as a deputy of the National Assembly. He began to split his time between Paris and Versailles, and accordingly was an active participant in these debates regarding the Constitution. He was growing concerned over the increasingly bitter factional conflict within the Assembly. He believed the only way to realize the Revolution's ideals was to unite the centrists and the Republicans against the Royalists. On the 25th of August, he wrote to Jefferson, asking his help in mediating these internal conflicts. Quote, I beg for liberty's sake that you will break off every engagement to give us a dinner tomorrow, since this is the only means by which to prevent a total dissolution and a civil war. End quote. Lafayette explained that the king's veto powers were at the root of their disagreements. Quote, some want it absolute, others will have no veto at all, but if we do not reach an agreement soon, we shall have no great majority in favor of any plan, and it must end in a war. End quote. Jefferson agreed to host this conference at his house the next evening. The participants were 8 deputies of the National Assembly, counting Lafayette, representing either side of the debate. Jefferson described them as, quote, leading patriots of honest but differing opinions, sensible of the necessity of effecting a coalition by mutual sacrifices, knowing each other and therefore unafraid to unbosom themselves mutually. End quote. Lafayette took the lead during these talks, telling his fellow deputies that it was urgent that a coalition of the patriotic factions be formed, as the discord among them could only play into the hands of the conservatives and ultra-royalists. Lafayette stated that although he had his own opinion on the veto issue, he was willing to compromise for the common good, since he considered it so important that an agreement was reached. The ensuing talks went on for 6 hours. As Jefferson later recalled, quote, during that time, I was a silent witness to a coolness and candor of argument unusual in conflicts of political opinion, to a logical reasoning, chaste eloquence disfigured by no gaudy tinsel of rhetoric or declamation, and truly worthy of being placed in parallel with the finest dialogues of antiquity, as handed down to us by Xenophon, Plato, and Cicero. End quote. In the end, the deputies were able to hammer out a compromise on the basis of a suspensive veto, which would grant the king the ability to place a temporary hold on proposed legislation, though not the ability to reject it outright. This would drastically limit the king's executive powers, and grant the legislature a permanent advantage in any negotiations that may take place while the veto was in effect. On the same day that this meeting took place at Jefferson's residence, the final draft of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen was presented to the National Assembly for their approval. For the past month or so, Lafayette's initial draft of the Declaration had been passed between multiple different committees within the Assembly for revision. The final draft of the document was largely the work of the Abbé Sieyès and the Comte de Mirabeau, who expanded Lafayette's original 13-point document into 17. Naturally, there were a number of differences between the two drafts, but for the most part, the spirit of Lafayette's original work remained intact. Again, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen remained a revolutionary declaration of human rights, very much worthy of its fame as a foundational document in the history of France and of the world. Its ratification by the National Assembly was a very promising step. With that having been accomplished, a vote was held on the suspensive veto clause on September 15th, and it passed with 673 in favor and 352 against. The day before, the Assembly voted for a single-chambered legislature by a margin of 849 in favor, 89 against, and 111 abstentions. This was another significant victory for the center-left coalition that Lafayette was so determined to keep together. And so, as the autumn of 1789 approached, it appeared to many in France, Lafayette included, that the violence and disorder of the last year's summer was firmly behind them. Feudalism, at least officially, was now a relic of the past. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen had been enshrined in the law, and the first steps towards devising a constitution and new system of government had been taken. Again, it still remained for these changes to receive official sanction from the king, but Louis had already demonstrated that he'd come to terms with the revolution during his visit to Paris that July. Even if he chose to defy the will of the people, the ascendant center-left coalition within the Assembly maintained that they were empowered to institute these changes with or without his consent, although for the sake of stability, they would have just preferred it if the king simply complied. Even before the Estates General first convened, Lafayette hoped that the revolution would be quick and bloodless. Up to this point, events had not exactly played out the way that he wanted, but now Lafayette believed that the end of the revolution was well and truly in sight, and he would now devote himself to seeing things brought through to a peaceful conclusion. In his correspondence from late summer to early autumn 1789, he continually expressed his wish to retire. During the ordeal with his attempted resignation, he had declared, quote, "I shall decline no burden, no danger. Provided that the moment calm is restored, I may rest." End quote. Writing to Simeon some time later, he reiterated this sentiment, quote, "My situation is truly extraordinary. Here I am at the center of a great adventure, and the only thing I really want is to get out of it, free from reproach at having indulged any thoughts of personal ambition, and having put everything to rights, to withdraw into obscurity at a quarter of my fortune which was mine when I came into the world. I have but one ambition, to return to zero." End quote. Lafayette himself was not the only one who felt overwhelmed by the events of the past several weeks. His family had shared in his burdens to an extent, especially his wife Adrienne, who regularly attended the aforementioned flag blessing ceremonies and assisted with efforts to collect alms for the poor. According to her daughter Virginie, Adrienne was a willing volunteer in these initiatives. Quote, "She believed so deeply in my father's principles and was convinced of his power to do good and prevent evil. She displayed incredible strength in facing the many dangers to which she was exposed." End quote. Nonetheless, Adrienne was still prone to anxiety where her husband was concerned, as Virginie writes, quote, "My father's table remained open to all. My mother charmed all our guests with her hospitality, but deep in her heart she was suffering. She saw that my father was at the head of a revolution whose outcome no one could foretell. No one was more terrified than she by the dangers that faced those she loved, but she rose above her fears and stood by my father in his fight against evil." End quote. In a journal entry from August, Maurice records a conversation that he had with Lafayette, in which he resisted entreaties to take greater power for himself. Quote, "I met with the Marquis de Lafayette, who is exhausted by a variety of attentions. I asked him if he could think of any steps that might be taken to induce the king to confer on him the government of Paris and its environs. He told me that he has had the utmost power his heart could wish for, and has grown tired of it. That he commanded absolutely 100,000 men, has marched his sovereign about the streets as he pleased, and could have detained him as a prisoner if he thought proper. He wishes, therefore, to return as soon as possible to a private life." End quote. Maurice doubted that Lafayette's wish to retire was sincere, writing, quote, "In this last expression, he either deceives himself or hopes to deceive me, perhaps both. But he is, in fact, the lover of freedom from ambition, of which there are two kinds, one born of pride, the other of vanity, and his partakes most of the latter." End quote. By his own account, Lafayette's most deeply held desire was, at this juncture, to help Louis XVI embrace his new role as, to paraphrase Bailly, the father of the French and the king of a free people. But despite being compelled to outwardly display his willingness to comply with the new order the revolutionaries were bringing about, in private the king was clearly struggling to adapt to these changes. Writing to the Archbishop of Arles, the king expressed contradictory thoughts regarding recent events, specifically the August decrees. He began his letter by commending the members of the first two estates for voluntarily sacrificing their class privileges for the sake of reconciling with the people. He then went on to state his personal opposition to their decision, writing, quote, "Even if this sacrifice was for the greater good, I cannot admire it. I will never consent to the despoliation of my clergy and my nobility. I will never give my sanction to the decrees that despoil them, for then the French people will one day accuse me of injustice or weakness." End quote. Had he been a more decisive ruler, he probably would have chosen to come down firmly on either one side or the other, to follow his friends and relatives into exile in the hopes of getting the other crowned heads of Europe to intervene in France on his behalf, or, alternatively, to actually come to terms with the limitations that were being placed on his authority and to accept his relegation to the status of figurehead. But Louis XVI was neither competent nor decisive. He refused to leave or to crush the revolution by violent force, but at the same time, he could not fully accept the changes that the revolution had wrought. He resolved to dig in his heels with the intention of putting a halt to what he saw as the worst excesses of the revolution. And so when the National Assembly expected him to sign off on the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen and the August Decrees in order for them to take legal effect, they found him to be less cooperative than ever before. He issued an official response on September 19th, denouncing the National Assembly for overstepping the bounds of its authority by interfering with the fundamental laws of the realm. He stated that he would be willing to accept the August Decrees, but only if certain conditions were met, principally that those affected by the abolition of feudal dues and hereditary offices would be adequately compensated. Meanwhile, in Paris, conditions were deteriorating, and fast. Thousands of laborers had lost their jobs due to the economic disruption the revolution had caused. Food shortages worsened on account of another poor harvest that year, and the price of bread increased by nearly 60% since that summer. Lafayette and the National Guard continued to do what they could to ensure the city was adequately provisioned, but they were powerless to change the simple fact of the matter, that there was not enough food to go around. Jefferson, whose term as the United States ambassador to France was set to expire, left Paris in September. Prior to his departure, he wrote an assessment of the situation in France to Secretary of State John Jay. Quote, "Paris is in danger of hourly insurrection. The patience of the people is threadbare. Civil war is much talked of and expected. The want of bread, were it to produce a commencement of disorder, might ally itself to the more permanent causes of discontent, and thus continue the effect beyond its original cause." End quote. As grim as things may have looked, Jefferson remained unusually optimistic. Quote, "I do not see it as yet probable that any actual commotion will take place." End quote. He placed great confidence in Lafayette's ability to keep a handle on things and to prevent any catastrophe. Quote, "His attachment to the patriotic party is evident, and he labors increasingly to keep it together. His command of the armed militia of Paris and his influence within the municipality would secure the city. This turn of events is so probable that I do not think that the patriots will venture on any act that will place themselves in opposition to him." End quote. Jefferson's predictions were only partially accurate. He was correct in recognizing that the people of Paris were frustrated with the lack of tangible political change, and that the ongoing food shortages were only driving further discontent. But in his assessment, he left out one critical factor. As the people of Paris suffered for want of bread, radical journalists placed the blame for their plight directly on Versailles, resurrecting the famine plot conspiracy from earlier that year. The king's refusal to ratify the August Decrees played directly into their hands. The radicals could now point to his inaction as proof of his true intentions. These radical journalists called repeatedly for the people to take up arms against the authors of their misery, to march on Versailles. A couple of these journalists were figures that I've introduced already, like Camille Desmoulins and Georges Danton. One that I have not yet introduced is Jean-Paul Marat, a 46-year-old former physician from Switzerland whose periodically, called L'Ami du Peuple, or The Friend of the People, was considered the most incendiary of them all. Marat frequently incited the public to violence, and directly called for the executions of those he deemed enemies of the people. Take, for instance, this passage pulled from an edition published in September 1789. Quote, "Open your eyes, shake off your lethargy, purge your committees and preserve only the healthiest members. Sweep away the corrupt, the royal pensioners, and the devious aristocrats, intriguers and false patriots. You have nothing to expect from them but servitude, poverty, and desolation." End quote. Newspapers and leaflets containing this sort of rhetoric continued to emanate from the Palais Royal, all with the support of the Duc d'Orléans. Lafayette blamed Marat, Danton, and Desmoulins and their ilk for fomenting unrest with their inflammatory rhetoric. He blamed Orléans for his malign influence over them all, but he also realized that the king's own actions, or lack thereof, were only adding fuel to this proverbial fire. Then, on October 4th, a highly scandalous story was reported in the Parisian newspapers. Earlier that week, the Flanders Regiment, a unit of the Royal Army, was transferred from its usual garrison on the northeastern frontier to Versailles. This decision is attributed to the Minister of War, the Comte de Saint-Priest. The press had been calling for a march on Versailles since September, and since the National Guard could not be relied upon, Saint-Priest reasoned that the 4 companies of the King's bodyguard and the 100 or so Swiss guards that were on the scene would be insufficient to defend the royal family in the event of a march on Versailles. The transfer of the Flanders Regiment, therefore, was intended simply as a precautionary measure, but ironically, as Schama points out, this decision only ended up provoking the very event it was intended to forestall. The mustering of more troops at Versailles would have been seen as a provocation by the citizens of Paris in any case. The Flanders Regiment in particular was infamous for their devotion to the king, and on the evening of October 2nd, their royalist sentiments were put on full display. The officers of the king's bodyguard held a banquet in the Royal Opera House for the men of the Flanders Regiment. This was standard practice in the French military at the time, though of course, holding a banquet while people were struggling to buy bread less than 10 miles away did come off as rather tactless. The reception was a raucous affair, with scenes of drunken debauchery playing out throughout the evening. The royal family actually made an appearance, at which point the partiers were so uninhibited from the copious amounts of alcohol being consumed that they practically tripped over themselves to enact gestures of fealty to the king and queen. It was reported that one of them yelled something to the effect of, quote, "Down with the cockade of colors. May everyone take the black. That's the fine one." End quote. Black was the color traditionally associated with the queen, and the ladies of the court began handing out black cockades while the partygoers tore the tricolor cockades from their hats and coats, throwing them gleefully to the ground and trampling them underfoot as they continued to dance the night away. Officers of the National Guard stationed near Versailles had been invited to attend this reception as a courtesy, and in due course the events of that evening were being reported in the papers. The radical press had an absolute field day with this story. They characterized the whole affair as a gluttonous orgy, and made a point to emphasize the gestures of disrespect shown to the cockade, which they contended were a deliberate insult to the entire French nation. In the atmosphere of fear and suspicion that already prevailed in Paris, these actions could only be interpreted as proof of the existence of a counter-revolutionary conspiracy. Desmoulins's publication, La Révolution de Paris, was just one of the many sounding the call to violent resistance. Quote, "The law allows the killing of those who threaten our lives. Anyone who wears a black cockade endangers the political life of our nation and the natural life of each citizen. Therefore, the first person who wears an anti-patriotic cockade must hang from the nearest lamppost." End quote. As incidents of popular unrest in Paris became increasingly frequent in mid-September and throughout the first days of October, Lafayette and the National Guard ran themselves practically ragged trying to keep the peace. They raced across the city, breaking up groups of rioters, but they were hardly able to restore order in one district when another would go into revolt and require their attention. In a journal entry dated October 2nd, Maurice wrote in reference to Lafayette, quote, "This man is very much below the business he has undertaken. If the sea runs high, he will be unable to hold the helm." End quote. The situation in Paris was volatile enough as it was. When news broke on October 4th of the latest provocation from Versailles, the entire city was certain to be convulsed by insurrection, just as it had that July. As Lafayette summarized his current predicament, quote, "All hell has conspired against us." End quote. But to hear what's next, I'm afraid you'll have to wait for the next episode. So do be sure to tune in again in 2 weeks as we continue to follow our protagonist as he tries to continue influencing the course of the revolution and to keep his head above water as he does it. Until then, please feel free to direct any and all questions, comments, or concerns to my email, perspectivesinhistorypod@gmail.com. You can also reach out to me on Twitter or Facebook. Links to both sites will be in the episode description. If you like the show, please consider helping me out by rating and reviewing it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or whichever podcast listening platform you prefer to use. Also, check out my eBay page where I occasionally list used books for sale. A link will be in the description as well. Anyway, this has been the Perspectives in History podcast. Thank you very much for listening. I'm your host, Willem Connor, signing off.
La nation l'aura par le prudent Lafayette. Tout trouble s'apaisera, assaillira ça ira, ça ira, réjouissons-nous, le bon temps viendra.
Ah, ça ira, ça ira, ça ira.
Par les flambeaux de l'auguste assemblée,
Ah, ça ira, ça ira, ça ira.
le peuple armé toujours se gardera. Le vrai d'avec le faux l'on connaîtra, le citoyen pour le bien soutiendra.
Ah, ça ira, ça ira, ça ira.
Quand l'aristocrate protestera, le bon citoyen au début rira, sans avoir à le troubler. Toujours le plus fort sera. Ah, ça ira, ça ira, ça ira, ça ira. Le peuple armé toujours se gardera.